going to cue up the video right now, show that.
As we can see, the victim, Tyler Robinson, running after shooting, he was wearing black t-shirt and black pants.
My husband laid down his life for me, for our nation, for our children. He showed the ultimate and true covenantal love. I'll never, ever have the words to describe the loss that I feel in my heart.
Tyler Robinson's name will forever be tied to one of the most shocking political assassinations in recent American history. And to understand the young man accused of killing Charlie Kirk, one must look not just at the act itself, but at the deeper undercurrents of psychology, ideology, and generational turmoil that pushed a 22-year-old from a quiet Utah town into the role of accused assassin. For here was a young man born into a stable home, raised in the Mormon faith, academically gifted, socially quiet, the kind of student who excelled in standardized tests, the kind of son whose neighbors described as mellow and without trouble. Yet beneath that calm exterior was a slow and corrosive dissatisfaction that would be fueled by the unique pressures of youth in the digital age, where isolation meets constant exposure to ideological extremes online, and where the search for meaning collides with the desire for notoriety. And in this tragic convergence, Robinson found himself looking at Kirk, the conservative activist, not as a man, but as a symbol of everything he opposed. And this dehumanization is central to understanding his motive. For psychologists like Lori Kramer have long pointed out that young people lack the empathy and long-term perspective that comes with age. And when anger, victimhood, and catastrophic thinking combine, they may see themselves not as aggressors, but as righteous avengers acting out of a warped sense of justice. And that seems to be precisely the lens through which Robinson's decision must be examined. Because on September 10th, 2025, when Charlie Kirk was shot in the neck by a single high-powered rifle round while speaking at Utah Valley University, the bullet carried with it more than physical destruction. It carried engraved messages that blended internet meme culture with radical slogans, a kind of nihilistic manifesto encoded in ammunitio, signaling both ideological rebellion and ironic detachment, which to experts like Joan Donovan reflects the online spaces where extremism thrives, where humor masks rage and memes become weapons. And in this sense, Robinson's motive may not have been a simple hatred of Kirk as a person, but a symbolic strike against what Kirk represented: right-wing influence, religious conservatism, cultural dominance, and the way Robinson left his digital fingerprints on bullets with phrases like, "Hey fascist, catch," and "Bella ciao," suggests not just anger, but performance, as though his crime were a stage designed to inspire others who shared his disillusionment, a performative act intended to resonate within the closed circles of internet subcultures, which thrive on coded messages, obscure references, and the thrill of rebellion. And when you peel back the layers of this act, you find a young man grappling with the emptiness of significance. As criminologist James Allen Fox explains, many youthful killers see violence as an opportunity to become important, to move from insignificance to notoriety. And in the life of Robinson, this longing for importance may have taken root during his years of academic achievement, where success set expectations but did not fill emotional voids. And when he dropped out of a traditional university setting after just one semester, shifting to a technical apprenticeship, one wonders whether he felt the weight of perceived failure, whether he saw Kirk's larger-than-life platform as a mirror of everything he did not become, and whether in striking him down, Robinson hoped to seize his own twisted kind of spotlight, and yet to reduce the motive purely to a craving for attention would be too shallow, because his ideological etchings reveal an obsession with framing the act as political, as though to declare war against a system he saw as oppressive. And here we must remember that Robinson was not aligned with a political party. He had not even voted, which makes the assassination not the act of a partisan soldier, but of a disillusioned young man seeking identity and radical rejection. And this is consistent with the broader phenomenon of radicalized youth, like Thomas Matthew Crooks, who attempted to kill Donald Trump, or Luigi Mangione, who shot a corporate CEO, where the common denominator is not always allegiance to a movement, but an unformed, volatile rage looking for a target. And in Robinson's case, the choice of Kirk, a man who thrived on being a lightning rod for ideological conflict, suggests that the motive was partly about silencing a voice he saw as spreading hate, as his own family admitted. Recalling dinner table debates where Robinson challenged Kirk's upcoming visit to Utah, framing him as a peddler of division. And this ideological clash within the home is crucial. For Robinson's father, a 27-year veteran sheriff's deputy, represented authority, order, and traditional values, while Tyler, quiet and analytical, was slipping into a darker worldview that rejected those very pillars. And in the end, it was his father who recognized his son as the assassin and persuaded him to turn himself in. A chilling irony that the man who upheld law and order delivered his own son into its arms. And perhaps the motive, at its most intimate level, was shaped by this generational clash between the stable expectations of his upbringing and his growing perception that those expectations were hollow, that institutions like family, religion, and politics were corrupt, and that only a violent gesture could express his disillusionment. And psychologists would call this catastrophic thinking, the inability to contextualize setbacks or frustrations, the leap from dissatisfaction to apocalypse. And in Robinson's worldview, Kirk was not just a man giving a speech, but the embodiment of a system he loathed. And in that sense, his motive fuses political anger with existential despair, making his act both personal and impersonal, both symbolic and deadly. And when authorities found cartridges engraved with nihilistic jokes and anti-fascist slogans, the message was clear. This was not only about killing, it was about communication, about leaving a trail of meaning for others who would get it, for those within online echo chambers who might celebrate the act as an inside joke. And this aligns with Donovan's warning that such coded references are not meant for the public, but for a subculture of extremists who thrive on shared humor as a tool of bonding. And so Robinson's motive was not simply to kill Kirk, but to turn Kirk's death into a meme, to collapse political violence into entertainment. And in doing so, he revealed the terrifying intersection between youthful immaturity and digital radicalization, where the line between irony and ideology dissolves. And one must also consider the psychological dimension of his relationship to violence itself. For unlike hardened extremists, Robinson had no criminal history, no violent reputation, which suggests that his decision was not the culmination of a lifetime of aggression, but a rupture, a sudden leap into violence, which criminologists often associate with youthful offenders who see their act not as part of a long criminal trajectory, but as a singular event that will define them. And in this sense, Robinson's motive may have been shaped less by long-standing hate and more by a sudden embrace of the fantasy of martyrdom or infamy, a fantasy nurtured by online stories of past assassins and shooters. And when he took that rifle onto the rooftop of Utah Valley University, he was enacting a script already written in his mind, a script where he would strike down a symbol, leave behind coded messages, and ascend into infamy. And yet beneath all of this, there lingers the question of whether he even fully understood why he did it. For youthful assassins often act from a storm of impulses: anger, despair, envy, ideology, attention-seeking, without ever consolidating these into a coherent motive. And that ambiguity is perhaps the most chilling part of Robinson's story, for it suggests that anyone caught in the same storm, under the same pressures of isolation, digital radicalization, and youthful rage, could likewise become a killer. And this is why the experts caution against dismissing Robinson as a lone madman, for his act reflects broader cultural fractures, a generation marinated in online extremism, struggling with meaning, and vulnerable to seeing violence as a solution. And so the motive of Tyler Robinson must be seen not as a single answer, but as a complex web. Political rebellion, nihilistic performance, psychological immaturity, generational disillusionment, and the intoxicating lure of significance, all converging in one catastrophic moment when a young man pulled a trigger and forever altered the course of political discourse in America. In the aftermath of Tyler Robinson's arrest, the focus of the nation shifted from the act itself to the deeper ripples of consequence. And if his motive in killing Charlie Kirk on that September night was tangled and ambiguous, the aftermath has only multiplied the complexity. For now, Robinson is not merely a suspect, but a mirror reflecting the fractures in American society. And as he sat in custody, the son of a sheriff's deputy accused of assassinating one of the most influential conservative activists of the 21st century, his case became an arena where psychology, politics, media, and morality collided. And perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the way his own father, a law enforcement veteran of nearly 3 decades, helped deliver him to justice, a gesture that carries symbolic weight beyond comprehension. For here was a man sworn to uphold law and order confronted with the unbearable truth that his own flesh and blood had committed an act of political violence. And in choosing to encourage his son to turn himself in, he made a choice of principle over blood. And yet one can only imagine the psychological torment this father must have endured, the questions he must have asked himself about whether he had failed his son, about how a boy raised in a stable household, given educational opportunity and moral guidance, could twist into a would-be assassin. And this family dynamic became a subplot that fascinated the public. For if Robinson was the killer, then his father's loyalty to law became the antithesis of his son's rejection of order, a living allegory of generational divide. But beyond the family there was the widow, Erica Kirk, whose response to her husband's death transformed grief into defiance, vowing to continue his mission, declaring that those who killed him had no idea what they had unleashed. Her words reverberated like a war cry across conservative circles, galvanizing Kirk's followers, fueling calls for vengeance, and feeding narratives that this was not merely the act of one disillusioned youth, but part of a broader campaign against conservatism itself. And here the political exploitation began, as figures like Stephen Miller invoked Kirk's final wishes to dismantle the radical left, as far-right commentators pointed to Robinson's supposed anti-fascist leanings, and as conspiracy theorists suggested that Robinson was merely a pawn in a larger plot. But in truth, what made Robinson's case both frightening and fascinating was that he did not fit the mold of an organized extremist. He had no party affiliation, no voting record, no criminal background, which made his act less about allegiance and more about disillusionment. And that very ambiguity became the soil in which narratives of every stripe grew, with the right painting him as the embodiment of radical left-wing violence, while some on the left dismissed him as a mentally disturbed lone wolf, while still others pointed to the role of meme culture, internet radicalization, and youth despair as the true culprit. And in the courtroom, this ambiguity took center stage. For while prosecutors charged him with aggravated murder, felony discharge of a firearm, and obstruction of justice, they also introduced as evidence the engraved bullets with cryptic messages, the online searches, the fragments of conversations with friends and family where Robinson allegedly framed Kirk as spreading hate. And all of these pieces were used not just to prove the act, but to probe motive, and yet motive remained slippery. For Robinson himself, when questioned, offered little clarity, alternating between silence and vague justifications, at times hinting at politics, at times at personal emptiness, which made the trial less about what happened, because that was clear, and more about why it happened. And in that courtroom, the larger societal questions were implicitly on trial. What is the role of social media in radicalizing youth? How does online irony bleed into real-world violence? How do young people facing identity crises and feelings of insignificance turn to assassination as a way to matter? And as these questions swirled, the media amplified every possible angle, some outlets humanizing Robinson as a troubled youth failed by systems, others demonizing him as a terrorist whose act was nothing less than an attack on democracy. And this polarization mirrored the very cultural divide Kirk himself had thrived upon, making his death a continuation, rather than a conclusion, of the ideological battle. And meanwhile, in the streets and online, Kirk's supporters held vigils, rallies, and protests, his image elevated to martyrdom, his speeches replayed as prophecy, while his critics wrestled with the uncomfortable reality that even if they opposed his views, political assassination threatened the very fabric of democratic discourse. And thus Robinson's act, instead of silencing Kirk's message, magnified it, gave it the aura of martyrdom, ensured its continuation through his widow and allies. And this cruel irony must have been lost on Robinson, if indeed he sought to dismantle Kirk's influence, because by killing him, he amplified him, turned him into a legend. And this irony is one of the great paradoxes of political violence, that the act of silencing often immortalizes. And so, one wonders if Robinson, in his youthful immaturity, could have grasped the long-term consequences of his act, or whether his vision extended only to the fantasy of the moment, of the rifle shot, the headlines, the attention, without considering the aftershocks that would ripple for years. And those aftershocks are profound, for in the months following the assassination, debates about youth radicalization, political violence, and free speech intensified, with universities questioning how to host controversial figures safely, with lawmakers debating security protocols, and with the public torn between fear and anger. And through it all, Robinson remained an enigma, described by neighbors as quiet and intelligent, described by professors as gifted, described by his family as increasingly political. And yet none of these descriptions fully explain why he chose to kill. Which brings us back to the speculative psychological analysis. Because perhaps Robinson's motive was not one thing, but many. Perhaps it was the slow accumulation of resentment, disillusionment, and rage, catalyzed by an online world that gave him language, memes, and symbols to articulate his anger. And when he etched those onto bullets, he was declaring not just opposition to Kirk, but allegiance to a subculture of nihilism, a culture that mocks everything, even violence, as entertainment. And in that sense, his act was not just political, but performative. A deadly joke told in the language of memes, meant for an inside audience that most of society would never understand. And this is what makes the Robinson case so chilling, because it shows that violence today can be wrapped in layers of irony, symbolism, and digital in-jokes, making it harder to trace, harder to prevent, and harder to even categorize. And yet, at its core, the motive may have been tragically simple. A young man, feeling small, sought to feel large, and in his immaturity, mistook destruction for creation, mistook murder for meaning. And the result was not only the death of Charlie Kirk, but the creation of a case study that will haunt criminologists, psychologists, and political scientists for decades. A story where family loyalty was tested, where ideology collided with nihilism, where a widow turned grief into a rallying cry, and where the entire nation was left asking how many more young people, lost in the labyrinth of identity and ideology, are out there waiting to make the same catastrophic choice. And in that question lies the true legacy of Tyler Robinson, not just as a killer, but as a symptom, a warning, and perhaps a harbinger of a darker era, where political violence is no longer the work of shadowy organizations, but of disillusioned youths seeking significance in blood.